The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, but early in the morning he arrived again in the temple area, and all the people started coming to him, and he sat down and taught them. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery and made her stand in the middle. They said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they could have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and began to write on the ground with his finger. But when they continued asking him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he bent down and wrote on the ground. And in response, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders. So he was left alone with the woman before him. Then Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She replied, "No one, sir." Then Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on do not sin anymore." Gospel of the Lord.
Once again this Lenten Sunday we have one of these dramatic gospel passages that so fixes itself on our imagination that we are drawn to reflect on it again and again. And so let us think through the characters in this brief but intense drama in the streets of Jerusalem. There are the Pharisees. They catch this young woman, married woman, in adultery, in the very act of adultery, and they bring her there to Jesus, ringing her around, placing her in the center. And they say, "We caught her in the act of adultery. There's no question about her sin. Moses says to us that we should stone her. What do you say?" And of course, St. John notes that this is to set him in a trap once again, just as earlier they had brought him the coin. Now, should we pay tribute to Caesar or not? What do you say? In this case, they want Jesus to either err on the side of severity, that is to say, yes, take this woman and stone her, but then he will lose the affection of the crowds who have come to sense his extraordinary compassion and mercy. They'll think of him as a harsh and severe man and walk away, perhaps. On the other hand, he can say, "No, let her go," and then he seems to distance himself from the authority of Moses and from the severity of adultery. So it seems that they've got him in a really good trap. Let's think for a second about this woman. She is a married woman. We know that because she's charged with adultery. And only a married woman would be charged with that at the time of Jesus. And she has been caught in these moments of pleasure, and suddenly she is utterly terrified. Worth thinking for a second about what she's feeling here. Her life has gone on, and she had this private life, and suddenly there's this interruption, and she's dragged out in this public place, and she's terrified, because she's at the mercy of all these strangers. She's a stone's throw away from death, and her fate is entirely dependent on what others think of her. One other little note, it must have occurred to her after a while, why are they bringing me to Jesus? Maybe she's never heard of Jesus. Who is this man? So that she might get the sense that not only is she being suddenly in danger of death, but that her fate is really secondary, that somehow she's being used for other people's purposes, which would make it even worse, it seems to me. And so here we have this terrified woman in the front of all these people, utterly helpless. And so we come to Jesus. What does he do in the face of this dilemma? He bends down and writes on the ground. Now, we need to kind of just let this sink in. Imagine what that's like, that scene. There's all this noise, all this shoving, and then suddenly there's a stillness as they wait for his response. And this is what he does. And gradually, the silence takes hold, we could imagine. Gradually, the silence takes hold. And he stands up and he says, "Whoever of you is without sin, let him cast the first stone." What goes through the minds of those men as they see this, as the silence descends? Whoever is without sin. Perhaps they're thinking, because after all, the sin in this case is that of adultery. Perhaps first their thoughts are, which of us have I committed this sin myself? Or perhaps they're thinking of the commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Maybe as the silence takes hold, their thought ranges a bit more broadly, and they find themselves under judgment for their own thoughts, and maybe for their own actions. And as the silence takes hold, it's as if the gravity of Jesus' silence pulls the stone from their hand, and it falls into the silence of his mercy. Jesus turns to the woman. Has no one condemned you? Neither do I condemn you. He who is without sin could have thrown the stone. None of them there could have, but he could have. He could have executed the judgment of Moses with complete legitimacy because he had no sin. But he who was without sin wants to make her and us the same as he is. That is to say, without sin. He came to take away sin, not to destroy the sinner. And so he does with this woman. He takes away her sin and sets her free. Go and sin no more, he says to her. Go and sin no more. It might be worth our reflecting on these last words of Jesus against our contemporary situation, because the mercy of Jesus is so dramatic and overwhelming in this instance that we can tend to forget, we might tend to think that adultery isn't really all that important, that it's just a minor little offense that, take it or leave it. And that would be a profound misunderstanding against the backdrop of all of Jesus' teaching and of the Old Testament. Go and sin no more, specifically this sin of adultery. And what is the status of adultery in your mind and mine as we absorb it from our culture today? It seems to me, as I gather, that adultery today is openly celebrated. We have famous rock stars and movie stars and politicians sometimes that they're still married to one person, and maybe in the case of a woman, she might be pregnant by someone else that she's now going with. So she's carrying on in an openly adulterous relationship and is celebrated to the skies. People follow in the gossip columns their every move. And people, I would imagine, younger people especially, would aspire to emulate them, to lead such a glamorous life where you can go from one love affair to the next. And without looking back, without counting the cost. Is it all that simple? Is it really that simple? Does adultery not carry any consequences of any serious note?